Hi, everyone. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land I'm on, the Darug people of the Eora Nation. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to all First Nations people who are watching. Thank you so much for joining us in this panel on decolonial poetics. I'm Eunice Andrada. I'm a poet, educator, and tonight's host. Or if you're tuning in from Australia, good morning. I'm so excited to be joined by my absolute poetry heroes, Merlinda Bobis and Rick Barot. Merlinda Bobis is an award-winning writer with 4 novels, 6 poetry books, a collection of short stories, 9 dramatic works, and various scholarly articles. She has written across genres and in 3 languages, English, Filipino, and Bicol. She taught creative writing for 21 years at the University of Wollongong and is now honorary senior lecturer at the Australian National University. She grew up at the foot of Mayon Volcano in Legazpi, Philippines. And we also have Rick Barot, who has published 3 books of poetry with Saraband Books, The Darker Fall in 2002, which received the Catherine A. Morden Prize, Want in 2008, which was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award, and won the 2009 Grub Street Book Prize, and Cord in 2015, which was a finalist for the LA Times Book Prize and received the 2016 UNT Rilke Prize and the PEN Open Book Award, and Publishing Triangle's Tom Gunn Award. His 4th book of poems, The Galleons, was published by Milkweed Editions in February 2020. Rick was born in the Philippines and grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. Those are both heavily abridged bios for 2 poets whose careers are filled with so many highlights. And I get so nervous trying to read those bios because of the amounts of syllables and those award names, but I got through it. So I first came to know Merlinda through our first interview in 2015, which focused on her novel, Locust Girl, A Love Song. And that work is an incredible political fable about borders, exploring the social, economic, and political borders that we navigate every day. And throughout my engagement with Merlinda's work over the years, it's hard to miss the strong themes of decoloniality that run throughout her novels and her poems. And Rick Barot is a poet I discovered a little later through the release of his latest poetry collection, The Galleons, which reckons with the aftermath of colonialism and intergenerational trauma. The Galleons is a work that is so stunning in the breadth of its storytelling and its lyricism. And I'm so in awe of the decolonial imaginations of 2 of these writers, and it is such an honor to be talking to them both. Before we dive into this huge conversation, I want to hand over this digital sala over to these astonishing poets so they can share their work. Let's start with Rick, if you could read us a couple of poems.
Thank you so much, Eunice. What a pleasure to be in this space, one that spans many time zones in a couple of days. And what an honor to read with Merlinda today and be in conversation with her as well. So I'm going to read a couple of poems from this new book, The Galleons, which Eunice just mentioned. And I actually need to mention that, look at the cover. The artwork is actually by a Filipino-Australian artist couple whose names are Alfredo and Isabel Aquilizan. And they're pretty well known internationally. So it was a real pleasure and just an amazing thing to have their artwork on the cover of my book. So this is a kind of an all Filipino kind of moment. So the book has 10 poems titled The Galleons scattered throughout the book. And I want to read a couple of those poems. They are the title sequence of the book. And this first poem is called The Galleons One, and it concerns my grandmother, who died at 92 years old a few years ago. So this is a kind of elegy for her. The Galleons One. Her story is a part of something larger. It is a part of history. No, her story is an illumination of history, a matchstick lit in the black seam of time. Or no, her story is separate from the whole, as distinct as each person is distinct, from the stream of people that led to the one and leads past the one. Or her story is surrounded by history, the ambient spaciousness of which she is the momentary foreground. Maybe history is a net through which just about everything passes, and the pieces of her story are particles caught in the interstices. Or her story is a contradiction, something ordinary that has no part in history at all, if history is about what is included, what is made important. History is the galleon in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, in the middle of the 16th century, swaying like a drunk who will take 6 months to finally reach his house. She is on another ship, centuries later, on a journey eastward that will take weeks across the same ocean. The war is over, though her husband is still in his officer's uniform, small but confident among the tall white officers. Her hair is marcelled, like a movie star's waves, though she has been too sick with the water's motion to know that anyone sees her. Her daughter is too, the blur of need at the center of each day's incessant rocking. Here is a ship, an ocean. Here is a figure, her story a few words in the blue void. So the second Galleon's poem that I'm going to read is the Galleon's 10, which is the last Galleon's poem in the book. And I was actually born in Cebu and grew up in, I spent my first 10 years in Ormoc, in Leyte. So, and then we immigrated here when I was 10, but I have deep and vivid memories and longings for my home province of Leyte and my hometown of Ormoc. So this poem is partly a kind of homage or an ode to that place. My father's parents, or my father's people, are also from Bohol, so Bohol figures into this poem as well. The Galleon's 10. I come from the lowlands. My mother's city was built on the river where the mountains fanned out to the sea, and the city thrived there. I come from farmers. I come from childhood's transistor radio, from the calachuchi tree and its white flowers. I come from prayer. My parents took me to a faith healer once, though no one now recalls the malady or the terms of the cure. I had a fate. It took me across an ocean. It has taken half a life to turn back and see what it was I left behind. I come from teachers and soldiers. On the island my father comes from, the people covered their bodies with tattoos. I come from soot, from ink. I come from people who honed their teeth to sharp points, who buried their dead in coffins shaped like boats for a journey. I come from horizon. I come from water. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for those incredible poems, Rick. Can we hear your poems, Merlinda?
Yeah, and thank you very much. I'm just adjusting the light here because thank you very much, Rick, for such potent poems. And I'm very pleased to be doing this conversation with you. And thank you, Eunice, for organizing this and the topic especially. Now, I'm speaking to all of you from the land of the Ngunnawal people here in Canberra. And this is where I live now and I make stories. First, I would like to wish everyone wellness and safety in these very difficult times. So I am reading from Fish Hair Woman, my novel, and then we'll segue to Accidents of Composition, my poetry book. And these are offerings of comfort, especially in these times of incredible losing and grieving. Paghaya, deep weeping. Paghaya. The wail is in the middle syllable. For some, a stifled exhalation. For others, a near scream. But always the breath travels the full distance from the groin to the gut, welling up to the throat. It is a weeping that is not about this or that moment. It has a history as long as the distance covered by that breath. The grave digger Painyo told me not to forget this lesson of weeping. You have to weep, not from the throat, but from lower down, just as in singing, so you don't grow hoarse because it takes forever to get to the last note. Remember, weeping is like singing and vice versa. So everyone can sing, talagang talaga, truly, truly. So let's hear you. Take it from lower down. A lot of breath in there and it does not run out. Go on, sing. It occurs to Painyu that he has better luck with spirits who listen to his incantations sometimes. He opens his little book. He begins to chant. Magdara, kibaldi sa danaw nin sakit, sigurado ang luluin ni. Magdara kibaldi, sa raro mo na danaw, hiwalat mo dumanini. Nay, nay, take a pail to the pool of grief. Make sure it has holes. Take a pail to the deepest pool and leave it there. This is the wake of the world. Each of us standing around a pool that we have collected for centuries. We are looking in with our little pails. We try to fathom the depth of the pool until our eyes are sore. We try to find only what is ours. We wring our hands, how to go home with only my own undiluted pail of grief. To wash my rice with, or my babies to drink. But look, the water is my deadkin, an enemy, a beloved, a stranger, a friend, someone who loved me or broke my heart. How to tell them apart, how to cleave water from water. Now, in this ongoing wake of the world, how do we really survive? Well, we can, because love is planetary. From the first urge, no, from the inkling of an urge, perhaps way before time, before the Big Bang, where black holes, matter and antimatter, and space were yet light years unknown to each other. This is the astronomy of our chance to meet, even with the most strange, most distant, and evolve by accident something even stranger, a ringed planet, a newborn star, or this thing called Earth. So, sweetheart, from the other side of the globe, ocean, river, field, mountain, wall, barbed wire, or the border of tanks and guns, faceless yet to each other, there is hope for us. Maraming salamat. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Merlinda. I always get chills whenever you read and whenever I see you perform, and those chills still come to me even though this is a digital performance. Yeah, I thought it would be good to start with these readings, especially from your most recent works, because they're such great platforms to ground this conversations, because as I mentioned, in both of your works, there are such strong themes of decoloniality. And I wanted to start this conversation by asking you, what does decolonization mean to you?
Should you go? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, for me, decolonization is a liberation strategy. It's the will and act that interrogates, overturns, and breaks out of colonial paradigms and narratives, and struggles against the imposition of a master narrative that excludes all other narratives. And I would like to express my solidarity with all others going through this struggle. Now, I just like to insert this. Relevant to this decolonization is the concept of decoloniality, which actually originated from Latin American thinkers. And I would like to cite the Argentinian semiotician Walter Mignolo. And he says that decoloniality is about delinking at the fundamental level of thought from Western modernity and its underpinning coloniality that prescribes a central paradigm of knowledge hierarchy and knowledge production. And this includes, of course, story making. And this central paradigm marginalizes and erases all other knowledge paradigms, and especially the lived stories of lives that are already marginalized in society. So for him, really, decoloniality is, which is necessarily bound with decolonization, is actually creating one's own knowledge base and one's story-making base that reinstates the lived, marginalized lives, like the life of the grave digger, chanting about the pull of grief in a time of war in his own language.
I was just thinking that Merlinda actually presented an amazing image of one way that decoloniality could mean to me. The image was take a pail to the pool of grief and make sure it has holes. I love the idea of the activity of decolonization as being this active taking of form of a vessel towards, you know, this really kind of large, unfathomable thing like grief, and the vessel itself has holes. So it is a kind of a marshaling of hope in the face of kind of limited or broken language and resources. So I want to thank Merlinda for giving me that really beautiful metaphor for the work that we're doing. As for my actual answer, I just want to say ditto what she said. For me, decolonization really feels like it's a kind of a two-part enterprise. The first for me is a kind of an opening of the aperture. So that the aperture, you know, we're all so focused and driven and kind of dictated by or determined by this master narrative that Merlinda mentioned. But if you exercise an opening of the aperture, you begin to kind of get an understanding of the larger contexts that are feeding the center, the kind of the ways that colonial structures like capitalism or racism or homophobia or misogyny are expressing themselves in that center. So that's the first part of the activity, opening the eye and the mind in a way to see that the center is contextualized by a whole network of other sort of energies and problems. And then the second part of the activity is obviously to take action. You know, given every person's sphere of labor, what is it that you can do to engender acts of resistance or critique or dismantling, knowing that those structures of power are in the center, and that center is a toxic but also really appealing and a consuming kind of center. So, you know, that's the way I conceive of the work that I do. It's a continual opening of the eye, but also a kind of translation of that new vision towards modes of work that are available to me, including teaching, including the poetry that I write, and conversations that I have with different people. So, you know, it begins in thought and eventually moves into action, even if those actions overall are modest.
Thank you both so much for those really wonderful metaphors to understand this. Rick, in a recent interview that you did with the Adroit Journal, you did talk about this opening of the eye. You talked about how in classes, in certain classes with your students, when you would talk about decolonization, you would say that fundamental to the practice of decolonization is seeing with critical clarity. And how does this opening of the eye function in your own poetics? This is a question for you both.
I'll go ahead and respond. For me, the strategy that I've been using a lot in my work over the last 2 books that I've written is the strategy of juxtaposition, where what happens when you take elements of the personal or the intimate or the domestic and you collide it or set it against larger scale, macro scale things like history and capitalism and large things like that. What happens when you bring those 2 kinds of things into the space of the poem? So that to me is the kind of the way that I've been conducting this kind of inquiry in my work. When I have the story of my 92-year-old grandmother situated next to the history of the galleon trade in the Pacific, what are the tensions and the kind of the critical kind of like dialogue that happens when those 2 things, which from one standpoint are really quite separate, but they're positioned next to each other. What is the counter narrative or the new narrative that is proposed when things that don't belong together are suddenly made to speak to each other or kind of acknowledge each other? So that to me is the poetic strategy that I've been using in my work quite a bit.
I'm just so excited. It's brilliant. I love this idea of the twofold process, and the opening of the aperture, because it's you return to the body. And that is very important because remember, it is bodies that are colonized. It's bodies that disappear in the knowledge framework of Western modernity most of the time. So, but when you say opening of the aperture, for me, it's not just the eye, but it's the throat. Where you can sing, where you can speak, and other stories. The windpipe, the voice box can accommodate, if it's open enough, you can accommodate other songs, other stories. And for me, as a Filipina Australian creative practitioner, all of this, the opening and eventually the action, is about storying back. It's always storying back, writing back against colonial frameworks and paradigms that marginalize and even erase my own body and bodies. I keep on returning to that. And identities. In my case, as a female, it's a female body, female creative practitioner coming from a particular culture, race, and geography. And so what I try to do with my decolonial strategies, it is actually, I use it in my choice of subjects and style. So I try to, going back to Mignolo, I try to delink, or probably even maybe more decenter, the Anglo-centric framework of story making. And I write stories, bodies, and lives that are feeling, thinking, doing within their own cultural worldview framework. And they're constantly refusing and struggling, resisting to being subsumed by that central narrative. And also I am, and they have to do it in their own language, with their own bodies. I'm trilingual. And so I write in English, in Filipino, and Bicol, my first language from the Bicol region. So for instance, when I was writing Fisherwoman, even when writing an English sentence, I insert the rhythms and cadence of Bicol, because I would not want the English language to totally erase my first, I call it my first heart's tongue. And then also, because I perform my work, in that way, I reinstate the body that is often invisible, especially that I'm working in the West where, the text, the written text in the book are privileged over the body. So these are just my ways. There are many other ways, but we can keep talking about it. But these are what I think consciously do when I write or create stories.
I want to add something to that because I'm so moved by what Merlinda just said in terms of how, you know, decolonization is predicated on reclaiming the body, the autonomy of the body that has been inscribed and colonized by texts and traumas that have been brought to that body. So it has to begin there. What, you know, what does it mean to write out of, to speak out of, to be in a body whose narrative has been taken away from the body that, you know, that owns that body, you know, kind of reclaiming of the body's autonomy and its force. It really has to begin there. And I imagine that Merlinda, when she teaches, that's one of the kind of tenets that she brings to the classroom, which is one of mine, that, you know, what does it mean to write out of your whole self, your physiological self, in addition to your creative and psychological, you know, and your emotive self. All of us have these constituencies within ourselves that that we tend to either disregard or silence or erase as a mode of survival. But to be a kind of a rich and, you know, powerful writer, I think it's important to understand that there are these teeming voices and multiplicities that need to be sort of heard or that want their poems written. And what does it mean to write out of those identities that we tend to either censor or just forget, you know, because it's necessary to do that most of the time. Otherwise, we would just sort of go crazy, right? But I think that opportunity of being the artist is that you can open those sort of like those voices and beings within yourself and channel that into your writing. You know, that kind of fullness of autonomy that also includes kind of broken selves within yourself, the ugly parts within yourself, even the evil and toxic parts within yourselves. Those selves want poems written also. You know, not just your best self should be afforded the space of the page.
Can I? Sorry, I just want to respond to what you said, the autonomy of the body, and I would like to also say it is a knowing body, because I believe in body memory. You know,
Yeah.
when you say inscribed by colonial narratives, colonial experiences, by trauma. So it's a knowing body. And if you look at this knowing body, I want to pit it against the knowledge hierarchy, because it's also about knowledge, the knowledge hierarchy of Western modernity.
That's right.
Look, it's actually also knowledge here, but it is actually knowledge in flesh and bones, in muscle, in grit.
Yeah. Right. And you know what, too, if you're a person of color, if you are a queer person, if you're a woman, there are these prescribed legibilities that we all participate in, that, you know, that the art community and the kind of all of the mechanisms for publishing and sort of like the whole apparatus for presenting art is predicated on bringing forth these prescribed legibilities. And they're usually attached to kind of simplified notions of what a brown body writes about, how a brown body expresses itself. So, you know, kind of asserting the kind of the multiple stories within the self is a way of pushing back against these prescribed legibilities that are determined usually by the white gaze that wants a certain kind of performative, ethnic sort of like, you know, self, and that's the self that they're able to read and understand. And it's usually a kind of a traumatized self that they privilege because they can understand that. But a complicated self that is expressing not just those things, but an additional sort of quotient of values and emotions, that's really hard on the apparatus of publishing and the art structure. But we have to kind of do our work of pushing back against those prescriptions, those prescribed legibilities. This is fun.
Yes, it is. I think I let Eunice.
I don't even have to be here. I could just throw out a topic and let you talk about it for hours
derailing
and
your
hours.
script, Eunice?
No, I love your other questions because I'd like to, yeah. So
Yeah, let's dive into them. So thank you so much for talking about, the capacities of decoloniality in poetry, as well as its possible scopes, writing about the multiple selves. And it's, I especially identify with what you both said about the capacity of decolonial poetics to help us reclaim our bodies, because our bodies have been erased and made to be invisible throughout history. I'm curious now about the kinds of challenges that decolonial poetics pushes up against. For example, the poet and activist Jasmine Gibson contends that there cannot be a decolonial poetics until there is the abolition of capitalism. How would you both respond to this?
well, okay. I think this is one can do a whole course on this. So the reality is the publishing market is a profit-driven capitalist enterprise. It's not a free market. And also we have to remember it's mostly Western economies that control this enterprise. So whose stories get published? Whose stories get heard? Whose stories disappear? Of course, Western economies would promote Western voices and sensibilities, self-perpetuating to maintain the power, the power structure. But you see, I believe this is where the colonial poetics comes in. And this is our responsibility, because I believe the colonial poetics has been creating another space for stories and story making disappeared by capitalism and colonialism. And by the way, capitalism is a colonial enterprise as well, has proven to be. So, and also I would like to consider the work of, say, independent presses, small independent presses, and their decolonial poetics that support diversity, other voices that try to retrieve other voices that are, disappeared in the dark by big publishers. And also thank God for the grassroots arts and story networks that create their own avenues and platforms for getting other stories out there. So while, Gibson says we have to abolish capitalism, I think this is the way of the world. This is reality. We work around them. And decolonial poetics is resistance against that reality that we cannot really escape from.
Oh, can I just quickly interrupt with a question from Facebook? I wanted to save the questions until after this discussion, but there's a question that's pertinent to what you said, Merlinda. I'm just reading it off my phone. Tim Evans asked, can you say a bit more about what Merlinda mentioned on how the written word and books are part of the colonial structure, as compared, I suppose, to a spoken or physically performed delivery?
Sorry, can I answer that, or can I give it to you, Rick?
No, go ahead, please.
Yeah. Well, so that the question is how the written word becomes part of the colonial. Sorry.
How the written word and books are part of a decolonial structure.
Of a decolonial or a colonial structure.
Sorry, a colonial structure.
A colonial structure. Because you see, I love books. I love the written word. That's my business. That's all our business. But you see, I also am wary of it because it fixes. The moment it's there, it's like histories, history books. It fixes a particular narrative. It's like and then we all eventually think that it is God's word, so to speak. Then we all believe, for instance, histories, the history of the triumphal histories, the histories of those who won the war, or of the colonizer, their version of history, written in books, and we subscribe to it, and we think that was the story. But on the other hand, remember, if you talk, for instance, if I, when I was researching Fisherwoman, I did research in the village of my mother. And you talk to those bodies, to the people, and it's that oral tradition of storytelling. And it is not just the story, the content, the words that tell you the story, it's the body. You know, the body does its own story. And I can see there are other stories that are not even revealed by the words that they say. So I actually think the body with its own language, even if it is not doing it in words that you know, speaks back, writes back. And that's why I really believe it is, I swear by the Filipino oral tradition of storytelling and performance, which we have to this day. So I guess that's how I would respond to Tim Evans' question. Yeah, but I would like to hear Rick's.
I'm forgetting the question altogether, but one thought that I had about capitalism and how we as poets who are invested in decolonization can respond to capitalism is to observe that capitalism prioritizes the consuming triumphalist individual, that capitalism is invested in people being simple, credit card carrying selves. That's how capitalism thrives, that we believe that as we buy, as we consume, as we own, our value is elevated. And this is predicated on a heroic version of the self. And that's a problem because, it has no room for empathy or for degrees of complexity within the self. So what can we do as artists and writers? We can create and foster sort of communal energies that respond to or resist the kind of fetishizing of the individual. Obviously, we're all individuals and we have our own egos and our own goals and ambitions, but reframing our sort of artistic work so that it's not drawing on a kind of striving mythology of the self, but in fact is drawing on a sense of communal energy, a sense of communal story, a sense of communal complexity. That is a very big paradigmatic shift that resists the kind of the forces of capitalism that are wired in us already. I think that this is analogous to what Merlinda was just describing in terms of Australia, but that's happening very robustly in the United States now. There are, for many, many decades, there were these very clear centers of literary power in the country. And over the last 20 years, that has really been dismantled. And there have been added communities like Kundiman, which is the Asian American group in the United States, or Kavikanam, which supports African American writers, or Cantamundo, which supports Latinx writers. But the eruption of these communities are one way of responding to the capitalist sort of narrative, which is that people are only individuals who are invested in themselves. These kinds of literary communities are erupting and disrupting the structures which are in place, specifically having to do with culture and literary culture in the United States. And I imagine this is happening all over the world as well, as indigenous people and writers of color and immigrant communities come of age in Europe, and those second generation people start to tell their stories. That's happening all over the place, that those community driven sorts of visions about art and literature are taking over the otherwise toxic capitalistic one.
It's really solidarity. When you say, I love that, that communal force. Mm-hmm. It's the solidarity of bodies inscribed by the colonial narratives. And, one of them is capitalism. But I like what you said about this credit card carrying consumer. And at this point, I just like to pay homage to Octavio Paz, one of my favorites, who actually said that, in relation to capitalism, he said, the market has no soul. They're not here. They're interested in books, but not in literature. So, and he actually said, it's not just about decolonial strategizing, but it is about preserving literature. Because the problem with a capitalist enterprise, just publishing certain books, is uniformity. They want you to all write and speak in the same voice. That is the voice that replicates the voice of power in the central narrative. So the problem, and Octavio Paz was saying, you do that, you kill literature. Uniformity kills literature. So what I'm saying is, even to those people who support that kind of central narrative and that kind of, this is the sensibilidad that we want, and usually, Anglo or Eurocentric, it is also safe if you actually run with this other, open your aperture and run with this other worldview of what literature should be, that it should be diverse. You actually save the literature of the world. It's also, and when you open up to other voices, it does not mean to say you lose your voice or you lose your power. In fact, it enriches the power. It gives it more, makes it more complex, to take it from what you said, Rick. Complexity is not about singularity, and singularity of narrative kills literature.
There's a First Nations Canadian writer who I really admire. Her name is Therese Mayat, and she has this wonderful idea about, she says that a lot of Indigenous people and writers of color are often kind of challenged to have a narrative that is predicated on trauma. And it's their one narrative that they carry around. And, it becomes sort of like this golem that you hold on to within your soul. But her kind of counter kind of like advice to that is, in fact, if you foster many different kinds of stories within yourself, in addition to the story of trauma or pain, that is bringing a kind of health to yourself and to the art that you make. So instead of making a fetish of your one sad story, generating and fostering many stories about yourself is a way of creating that complexity. But that's really a kind of a miniature version of what you just said, Merlinda, about literature as a whole. If literature is invested in just sort of like very few stories that keep reifying, the marginalized people as the other, that literature is eventually going to collapse. But if it keeps being invigorated with all kinds of stories from all places on the literary terrain, that is a way of it's like an ecosystem, the grass that's over here needs the marsh that's over there, that needs the tree that's over there, that needs the water buffalo that's a mile away, right? And so that's the way I think that literature can work, that the more people are actually contributing to that ecosystem, that is generating health for that system.
Hats off to that. You see, when you talk about the ecosystem has light and dark parts. There's the green, there's the brown, there's the dry, there's everything. So when you say that there is a danger, and I love that, there is a danger of reifying promise, that we focus, that's the golem. Right. We focus on that, all the sad stories. And that's why I keep on asking, where are our happy stories? There is happiness, there is joy, there are good things, and especially, and how we, because of our position, resisting that central narrative, it's almost conflictual, the relationship. So we write about conflicts a lot, we write about trauma, but I would like to balance that. And in fact, we have to decolonize that too.
Right.
This kind of worldview, open the aperture to other things, the happy stories. So in my case, for instance, in Accidents of Composition, I write about kindness. It's a kind of love. And I've just finished a manuscript on kindness at this time, because I think we have to actually put that on the table, especially in these times. we have to believe that it exists. It does. It happens. And they are also invisible. Little acts of kindness have to be retrieved from the darkness and put on the table. Otherwise, that's the end of us as a species.
Well, you know, and I love the idea of kindness as a priority, because kindness, given sort of the spectrum of priorities that literature can have, kindness is not sort of in the center. And so you're engaging in a kind of centering of what is usually conceived of as the more modest kind of emotions or the modest qualities. And one of the things that I do in my own teaching is to remind students that a lot of Western literature is really invested in the heroic and the mythic, which are once again aligned with the individual striving through, you know, a challenging landscape and arriving at a triumphalist sort of space. That's the kind of wiring that our literature has. But what happens when you actually look to the sides of the mythic or the heroic or the emotions that are associated with that, to the anecdotal, the acts of kindness, the acts of sort of like the seemingly smaller things that are actually associated with the domestic or with the everyday living, existing, and thriving body, which is usually separate from the heroic and the triumphalist. So that kind of refiguring of what's actually sort of like the priority in any piece of art that you make, away from the fetishized individual to an individual that is full of potential for kindness, you know, full of potential for other smaller acts of being and relating to other people and to the environment and to other things.
But also, sorry, I just, it's just, but kindness, you see, so I'm very much into this kind. And actually, I'm thinking of even the kindness of things we don't even acknowledge, the birds. I feel the comfort. It might, well, the bird might not be saying, I'm being kind to you, but just the comfort that a bird,
right,
in the morning, a bird song gives me, or a flower. For me, that's a kind act of the universe. But I would like at this point to actually put on the table a Filipino traditional social value, kapwa. The kapwa is really about that. You know, the kind of relational. Kapwa is self-other in one. We don't actually have, if you look at the indigenous Filipino value of kapwa, we don't think in terms of the Western idea of self versus other. Because self-other is actually, they're separate. For Filipinos, kapwa, self-other are one. It's one word, in fact. So I will say, Eunice, you are my kapwa. Rick, you are my kapwa. And I'm also your kapwa. But it's this, it's actually, when you think of it, it's a knowledge base. It's another way of looking and knowing the world. And I think, so which is part of it is kindness. It is in that kapwa space where you can talk about kindness, where you can acknowledge kindness and retrieve it from invisibility.
But even think about the English word. It is also resonant with that fusion of the self and the communal that you just described. Think about the word kindness and its relationship to the word kinship. They're related.
Yeah. And what is kindness in Filipino is kagandahang loob. Actually, which is, and I love it, isn't it? Because loob is spirit, beautiful spirit. But in Bicol, in my first language, it is kabuotan. So buot is still spirit, but ka is about the other. So you are my co-spirit. So if you put the Filipino kagandahang loob and Bicol kabuotan, it's beautiful co-spirit. Isn't that? And I think, and which is what kindness, and that's our word for kindness.
Thank
Over
you
to
both
you,
so
Eunice.
much for, no, I wanted to let you go on and on and on. I'm curious about, we can circle back just a little bit to the points that you two both made about disrupting colonial paradigms of knowledge. For example, through telling the full story of our kindness, of our kapwa, and not just focusing on this trauma-based narrative. And that sort of brings me back to something the poet Eve Ewing said about how if we only focused on the damage of our communities and presenting that damage to the world, it's sort of a violence onto our own communities because we're not telling the full story. I wanted to ask you, because you both teach at universities, how do you think the teaching of decolonial poetics can be disruptive in those kinds of spaces that have historically been strongholds of colonial power? Do you think a decolonial poetics can be cultivated within institutions like universities?
Rick, you're about to teach.
I mean, that is the kind of the tension that I think every teacher faces, because any institution, including and maybe especially a university, is prescriptive, or it's invested in certain kinds of rules or structures or procedures. And so how do you navigate your way through that as somebody who is interested in teaching, you know, autonomy and critical thinking and justice? And so that kind of negotiation is something, you know, I've been teaching for more than 20 years. And that is still something that I have to navigate every new term, you know, given the institutional kind of determinants that are in place. What are the small or large acts of radicalism that I can bring to the classroom, to the readings that I bring to my students, the assignments, and the kind of ideas that I give to them? So, you know, maybe in the end, I just think of myself as a pretty modest person, in the sense that I'm always asking, you know, what am I capable of given the sphere of influence that I have? I think that, you know, in another life, I must have been an office manager in a sense that I'm always very practical. I know other artists and teachers who are incredibly conceptual and visionary. But I'm always sort of wondering, what can I do today in terms of what my students are thinking about and reading and engaged with that is sort of doable? You know, what is it that can actually be realized on a day-by-day, week-by-week basis? And I'm hoping that those small everyday acts of discussion and learning and teaching are somehow going to reconfigure the spaces that the institution, you know, the spaces of the institution itself somehow. Because otherwise an institution is just a building with rooms, you know. The people inhabiting those spaces are the ones that can create change within those institutions. So I don't know if that quite answers your question, but, you know, what can you do with your hands? That seems to be the response that I can come up with, knowing that I only have two hands.
But I think that those are very important things to do, Rick. They're crucial. This everyday teaching and discussion with the students and relating with the students that are that's the lived life that we go through, that can actually that can carry with it our decolonial poetics. You see, I'm now retired, or I did early retirement after 21 years of teaching creative writing. But you see, when I was teaching, and I was teaching to mostly Anglo-Australian students who are monolingual, and I am the other. So, and what I did, the only thing, and I did this throughout those years, my decolonial poetics was in my course outline or syllabus. I made sure I taught literatures from different parts of the world. And I brought poems in their original languages, and we tried to read them together with English translations and stories, lives from different parts of the world. And you see, the interesting thing with this is, so I do that, I plan every week. What can I do with my students this week? And how do I bring this new voice to them? But you see, my motivation is not just to decolonize Anglocentric literature or worldview, but I'm thinking of my students.
Mm-hmm.
These are the aspiring writers, the writers of the future, the teachers of the future. And I want them to show to them that if you listen to other lives, other voices, other aesthetics, and other poetics outside of your familiar Anglo-European aesthetics or poetics, this will enrich your own voices. And I always encourage my students to learn another language. I always said, look, if you learn another language, you understand better how your own language, English, operates. So these little acts, I don't even think of them as strategies. It's just a way of, because I guess it's very interesting. Now we're talking about this in the context of decolonial poetics, but I wasn't even thinking consciously of decolonizing. I was thinking of my students. I was thinking of literature. If I want a literature that is vibrant for the world, I have to do this. I just felt that the responsibility of myself as a creative practitioner is also a responsibility as a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
What voices do you put out there? It's not just your own voice, but the voices of others, diverse voices. And I guess, so I go back to what you said, Rick, the everyday teaching, the everyday discussions, and the everyday care for your students that hopefully multiplies the care. They care about things, others outside of themselves.
Mm-hmm. That's, you're talking about pedagogy that's in a way inextricable from your work as a writer of decolonization or decoloniality. And I love what you said about, the fact that the kind of diversity of voices and experiences and identities that you bring to your predominantly white classroom is ultimately not just to sort of like give them, these dioramas of otherness that they can look at as though they're in a museum, but it's actually also meant to remind them that they are complex selves. These students are absorbing all kinds of predetermined narratives from the culture around them about what it means to be a white person or a straight person or, a person who is 19 and of a certain socioeconomic class. So they're constantly absorbing these kind of like prepackaged narratives about who they are. And what you're actually doing when you bring in this diversity of voices is triggering within them the permission to see themselves not in the light of those received narratives, but the actual narratives that they embody. And so, I love what you just described because I aspire to that myself.
I think it is actually empathetic teaching.
Mm-hmm.
Relating within the classroom. And I just want to give it, and sometimes you get hostile response that is very, it can be very stressful, but then you can have your successes. And I just want to share this with you. And it moved me so. I brought to class the work of Fronteras Americanas by the the Argentinian Canadian playwright. I remember, I'm having a senior moment. Guillermo Verdecchia. And then there is a section about someone going to Santiago, getting shot. And the only thing that is, and we were reading that section of the play, there's only a shoe on the street. And then he finds that it is a particular size 6 or size 7. So we were reading that first in Spanish, and then reading that in English. And then after the reading, one of my students said, "That's my shoe size." We were all stunned. We were all silent. And it nearly made me cry, because it is actually about that. It is my own shoe. It's putting yourself in the shoes of the other, which is what empathy is, but without thinking that that shoe is yours. We have to also remember that shoe is not the shoe. But look, in that moment, all the students in that class had an experience that they'll never forget, because everyone really got stunned. And so I guess the institution, you have the institution, there is a building, but there is the human space of the classroom.
Yeah.
If you come to that as a teacher with empathy, with a heart, I think, then you will open other apertures like the heart.
There have been so many comments from people online saying they are so blown away. They can't even think of questions.
Are there actually people online, Eunice? Because it feels
there
like
are.
it's just
it's just the three of us.
That's my phone right now. And I know in Zoom it just seems like it's just us, but there's a crowd online. We have a question from Hari Aluri. He says, recognizing the dangers of writing as fixing and also wanting to offer vibrant ecosystems of literature, do you have suggestions for how to integrate these decolonial practices in the acts of revising or creating the work itself?
That's a great question. You know, once again, I'm going to try to be practical. And what's the name of the person with the question?
Hari.
Hari. I would invite Hari to take a piece of paper and a pen and write down all of the verbs that they aspire to in their writing. Does that mean, does that mean heal? Does that mean speak? Does that mean describe? Does that mean interrogate? Does that mean critique? So that you have a list of all of the goals and aims in specific sort of terms that you want your writing to encompass. And then ask your writing to meet those words, those directives in as many ways as you can. You don't have to choose just 2 or 3 aims in your writing. Go for all of it. But first you have to identify what your aims are. If you have a list of 20 or 30 verbs, that means that you are a writer of rich ambition. And now the work that you have to do is write the poems or the stories or the essays that can embrace as many of those aims as possible.
Well, Harry, I love that because the practical tips, it's like, for me, when Harry was talking about revising, when you're revising your text and, how do you incorporate the decolonial poetics? But it's not just we're not even talking here about the big picture of decoloniality in relation to that bigger picture of coloniality. I'm just talking about your own practice, you see, with your own, for instance, here's a little poem. What I ask my students sometimes, even trying to make sense of the poem, or of the self-writing that poem, make a map of your poem. I'm a very visual writer, and I do that. And when I plan, especially in big notes, I have to make a mud map. Where is it going? The poem is a geography. So I make maps. What's happening here? Where is it going now? And when you do that, where you're able to find hidden intentions you're not even sure of. And you clarify certain things, but also you understand what's included or excluded in the map. So that you actually, for instance, say, let's just picking up from what we said about we focus too much on trauma, So if it's all about that space, what is not there? So when you're making a map, you do not just talk about the words, the spaces between words also is part of your map. What is not there? So what are the narratives that you have disappeared as far as your own life is concerned? Because it's a complex life. It's a complex body, a complex self. So think of it as play, and it's fun. And you, very surprisingly, you don't only make a better poem because you understand your poem better, you actually write new poems because you actually think, oh my goodness, I have never even thought of this space that I have never delved into. That blank space, is so important. Now let me hear that. Let me give that a chance. And that could take you into another geography, another poem that hopefully, in a way, decolonizes your obsession of only a particular subject. We fall in love with certain subjects, or
Right.
even style. So it takes you, it catapults you out of that. I think the mud map is a very helpful thing, very practical too.
I love the idea of the mud map. It reminds me of an earlier phrase that you had that I really loved, the new astronomy. But I'm also thinking, in relation to that question that, we also have to decolonize our writing process because given the forces of the marketplace, there's the expectation that the resulting work of art should be relatable and marketable and be a commodity. And so, we need to kind of like ask ourselves, what is the revision process for? Is it towards, kind of like deeper inquiry and understanding? Or is it because I want to write a poem that wants to be published in a magazine or in a book? And so kind of asking yourself what the aims are of the poem and your own investment in the poem, that's a good place of kind of like complicating the poem, and then knowing that there are some poems that need to be messy and are hard to relate to, but they speak a particular kind of, truthful authenticity to your own kind of, experience. So, always sort of like asking, what are the poems that I'm writing for my soul? What are the poems that need to speak towards a legible discourse? What are the poems that are in a kind of liminal space between the privacy of the lyric and sort of like the, the articulation of the civic? But kind of understanding where your work is as it changes from poem to poem, knowing that we are often made to feel that every poem has to end up being a consumable item that everybody can kind of relate to. That's not always the case, I don't think.
Yeah, well, I just like to pick up from what you're saying, because the poem, you're writing a poem, what is your goal with this poem, with this text? But I think every writing is about also interrogating the self.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it is about interrogating the self and even finding things that you do not like, that you hate probably. But I always say life is short. It is as short as a poem. Why do I say that? Because even the little poem encompasses a cosmos. And parts of that cosmos you don't even know.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a constant. Sometimes you wonder whether we're actually writing the same poem over and over again, or the same story over and over again, and trying to make sense of something.
Mm-hmm.
That making sense, that's, as you say, liminal space is that space of making sense. You're always in transit. The poem really is a border poem, isn't it? Because you're always in the border trying to find out what is this, even if you think you have fixed a territory.
Yeah.
By having your finished poem published out there. In my case, even if the poem is published, when I look at it again, I find a new poem. And that's what I mean. It is my life is short. And I know that. And I can only do so much in that short life. In the same way that a poem can only do so much in that short life. But having said that, it is big. That short life is a big space. It's a cosmos. The poem is a cosmos. And as Octavio Paz said, it is every poem has the multitude, the fraternity of the stars and chemicals. And I can't really quote him, but that's actually one of the best lines that I've read about describing poetry. Associations and differences all together in one poem. And that is in a single poem. So you might think that your life is short, the poem is short, small, is a cosmos. And if you actually, like going back to Harry, if you are looking at that and looking at the geography of the poem, you will find that it is, there are so many revelations for you and for your overall creative practice.
Yeah.
And you're living as a human being. Let's not forget that.
I love that, because it reminds me of Lorca's Duende, that we have to keep honoring what is unruly in us, even if that means the sacrifice of the legible poem.
I thank you both so much for that amazing answer to that question from Hari, and all that extended advice. Just one more, it's not a question, it's just a point. Rizel says, I'm loving this. Tita Merlinda and Tito Rick, please have a podcast. I would listen to anything you talk about on it. Anything. But I just want to thank you both so much for your time. My hope is that this conversation will be in lineage with many other conversations on decoloniality in poetry, especially decoloniality in contemporary Filipinx literature. Thank you so much to everybody who's tuned in on Facebook Live. Thank you to Merlinda and Rick. On the event page, I'll post up links to Merlinda and Rick's website so you can explore more of their amazing work. And that's it from us. Thank you so much, and see you at the next Digital Sala event.
And thank you, Eunice, and thank you.
You.
Thank you, all of you. And remember, be kind. You can't go wrong with that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.